Καλησπέρα. Ευχαριστούμε πολύ για την παρουσία σας εδώ. Ευχαριστούμε πολύ τους φίλους που ήρθατε στο Zoom. Τα καταφέραμε και για δεύτερη φορά να μαζευτούμε, να ακούσουμε τον καθηγητή Edhem Eldem. Πριν όμως ξεκινήσει, θα ήθελα να ενημερώσω και θα το συνεχίσω με αγγλικά, ότι έχουμε την πολύ μεγάλη χαρά να τον έχουμε ανακηρύξει επίσημο μέλος του Ινστιτούτου Μεσογειακών Σπουδών. So, it is with great pleasure to announce to you today that our Institute of Mediterranean Studies Scientific Council and the board meeting of the Foundation of Research and Technology have unanimously approved our proposal to make Professor Edhem Eldem an honorary affiliated member of the Institute for Mediterranean Studies.
Thank you.
Edhem Eldem is undoubtedly one of the most important and influential Turkish historians of our time. He studied at the University of Boğaziçi and completed his postgraduate studies at the University of Boğaziçi, where he submitted his thesis with the subject of French commerce of Constantinople in the 18th century, supervised by the leading French Ottoman historian Robert Montran. Ever since, he teaches at the University of Boğaziçi, and since 1998 as a full professor. And he has been the director of the Institute of Advanced Studies of Social Sciences. It's the same university?
Yes.
Yes. And head of the Department of History. He has also taught as visiting professor at the Universities of California, Berkeley, at the École des Études de Sciences Sociales, I'm sorry for my French, at Paris, at Harvard University, at Columbia University, at University of Maximilian of Munich, and elsewhere. He's honored with various prestigious grants and prizes, and since 2017, he has the international chair of Turkish and Latin history at Collège de France. His scientific research is impressive, in breadth, volume, and always excellent in quality. He covers academic fields, very different between them, from the external trade of Levante in the 18th century to the Ottoman finance. Republic of Istanbul in the late Ottoman period, the history of Ottoman archaeology, cemeteries, tombstones from the parts as well of the history of Tropion. Thank you. Apart from books that he has edited or co-edited, he has authored more than 25 books, many of which have been translated in other languages, and almost 200 articles. So, Professor Eldem, we welcome you in the family of the Institute of Mediterranean Studies. We are proud and very happy to have you with us.
Thank you. It's a great honor.
So today, he will talk to us about the forests and the trees, Boğaziçi University's ongoing struggle as an illustration of recent political changes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tina. It's truly an honor to have been given this honorary position at an institute which I admire much for the work it has done and is still doing. It's an impressive institution, and frankly, I could think of no greater honor than being a member of this institute. So that means, I think, that you'll see more of me in the near future, and that, of course, is going to be with the greatest pleasure. I'm
going to do something that I don't like doing and that I'm doing more and more frequently in the past years. That is, talk about the present. I generally joke about the fact that I like them dead and preferably buried, which is a typical historian's reaction, especially for me, because for me the end of the world is more or less 1914. And I've worked a lot on the 18th century, but for the past 20 years or so, I've concentrated on what is called the long 19th century, which starts somewhere in the 18th century and goes on until World War I and all the dark things that happened in the 20th century. So I've tried as much as possible to avoid the present, not just because I'm a historian, but also because I'm conscious of the dangers of comparison between the past and the present, the ease with which one can be tempted into drawing some kind of a conclusion about continuity and change. So I've tried as much as possible to avoid it. And yet, the more the political situation in Turkey has evolved, let's say, in the past 10 or 15 years, the more I've found myself forced to address issues that involve some kind of a comparison with the past, or at least a look into possible forms of continuity in some of the darker aspects of the political situation as we see it today. This is also linked to the fact, and I think that is a legitimate vengeance, to the fact that all governments in Turkey, ever since the beginning of the Republic, have used and abused history. And this government is no exception. In fact, it has brought it to a level that is kind of unprecedented. But what's important to me is that the obsession of the present government is not with history as a whole, but with a very specific topic in history, Ottoman history. And that's my history. So if they touch my history, I'll touch their politics. So that's the revenge part, if you want. That's one of the reasons why I feel compelled to address certain issues of say, the political present with all the risks involved. You may have guessed from the title, the very subtle metaphor I've used for the title of this talk, that I am going to try to look beyond Boğaziçi. Boğaziçi obviously is the tree, and Turkey is the forest, although some people at Boğaziçi might think that the forest is really Boğaziçi and that Turkey is just a tiny tree in comparison. But what I mean to say is that I don't want to engage in something that might sound like a martyrology. And, in Greece, I don't think you know what martyrology is, right? So I don't want to turn this into some kind of a lamentation and some kind of a sequence of events and of grievances, again, concerning the recent developments at Boğaziçi. The reason is that it's a specific case. It's something that hurts me, hurts my colleagues a lot. And I try as much as possible to avoid the personal, sentimental, emotional dimension of this problem. But again, as a historian, as a social scientist to a certain extent, I think it's important to look beyond an epiphenomenon or a phenomenon and try to link it to something broader and try to integrate it into a discussion about what is going on in a certain social, political, economic even environment, rather than concentrate on the nuts and bolts of one very specific event. However, obviously, I have to start with some kind of a short account of what happened. What happened? What is this crisis at Boğaziçi? The crisis started very precisely on the night of the 1st to the 2nd of January 2021. So the very beginning of this year, when President Erdogan issued and signed a decree that appointed a certain Melih Bulu to the presidency of Boğaziçi University. Melih Bulu was a completely unknown person, well, completely. I mean, he had been the rector, apparently consecutive rector of two minor private universities. It was clear that he was an apparatchik, if you want, an instrument of the government, and the government in Turkey means mostly Erdogan, of the government in trying to do something to Boğaziçi. I won't go into the details, but by and large, the main aspects of this struggle is, first of all, this nomination of an outsider, because what you have to know about Melih Bulu is that for the first time, well, for the first time, not exactly, there was a precedent to that in the 1980s, but for a very long time, ever since 1992, this was the first time that the university found itself with a president who was not from among the faculty of this university. Second, he was not elected, and therefore he was parachuted in a very legal fashion, because in 2016, again, by decree, Erdogan had modified the rules of the game, say, and had made a very smooth, according to him, transition from a system where there was some kind of an electoral system to one where he was the sole judge of the appointment of a rector to any university, any state university in Turkey. So he came as a shock, but a shock that could have been expected, because ever since 2016, Erdogan had already interfered in Boğaziçi's system, governance, by refusing to appoint Gülay Barbarosoğlu, who had been elected by, I think, 87% of the electorate at Boğaziçi. Boğaziçi elects its presidents on the basis of the faculty. I mean, students and the administrative staff are not included in the process. That's something we can discuss, but you know. She had been elected with 87% of the votes, and he refused to sign the decree that would have terminated her presidency. And instead, a compromise was found, was made. He appointed her former vice rector, because this would have been her second term, her former vice deputy was appointed, somebody who was from inside the university, a certain Mehmet Özkan, a scientist, not like us, you know, a real scientist, hard sciences, things we don't understand anything about, but somebody who was known for his, let's say, conservative profile, and with connections with the party in power, the AKP. There were some protests at the beginning, especially by students, but at the end of a week or two of turmoil, the faculty especially came to the conclusion that this was as good as it would get under these circumstances, and that basically we should do with this president who had the advantage of being from within and who was part of the preceding governance, and therefore had been, in a way, sanctified by Gülay Barbarosoğlu, who had not been appointed. But this, of course, was a wake-up call, in a sense, to the fact that worse could come at the end of the four-year term of this compromise. And to tell you the truth, as the faculty of the university, we didn't do much to try to plan ahead what would happen, what might happen at the end of the 4 years. At the end of the 4 years, that was in November 2020, nothing happened, and Mehmet Özkan was confirmed as an interim president because his term had come to an end. But a few months later, 2 months later, practically, we got the news, midnight news, that this Melih Bulu had been appointed. That was the beginning of a protest. That was the beginning of a rejection, a refusal by faculty, by students, by practically everyone who counts as part of the Boğaziçi University community. What followed was a rather erratic way in which the powers to be tried to conquer the university. They did it in several ways. First of all, they tried to appeal to some eventual possible supporters from within, and they found very few, only 2 or 3, who were willing to participate in the new governance. But that was important because they wanted to have a control over the Senate and over the university board, because that's where the university governance takes place. But they did something more. I can't remember exactly the date, but just a month or a month and a half after this coup, they created out of the blue, and again at midnight, there's something to inspiration that comes to the president late at night, apparently. 2 new schools were created. A school of law, which we didn't have. There were only 4 schools in our university, and a school of communications. And this was a barely masked attempt at basically drowning the existing Boğaziçi in a potentially more crowded, larger university, with the 2 schools working as Trojan horses, if you want, in order to penetrate the university by appointing new faculty. The appointments have not taken place yet, but we already have a dean of the non-existing School of Law. And you can see immediately that the Senate consists of the representatives of the main bodies at the university, one of which is, of course, any school. And of course, that was 1 more seat at the Senate and at the university board. So you can see that the plan was basically to gradually penetrate, conquer the university by creating new schools and by increasing faculty numbers and eventually student numbers. The protests, and especially student protests, did not stop. And the result was that the conflict entered a more violent phase very soon, and the university and our campus was witness to something that hadn't happened to that day, which is the presence of the police and of the secret police on campus. And the tension between the faculty, the students, and the new presidency increasing, police force and violence was used in growing at a growing rate against mostly the most vulnerable of these actors, the students. There were several crises that involved true violence against students based on pretexts that range from occupying the campus or being on campus during the pandemic, without respecting social distance and whatever. So, using something. And when you know, for example, that just a year earlier, the Hagia Sophia was opened as a mosque in presence of 350,000, that's what the government says, individuals with no protection whatsoever concerning the pandemic, it's obvious that this was just an excuse. But there were other provocative moves, mostly directed again at those sections of the student body that were either more vulnerable or more active. LGBTQ groups were particularly targeted, especially after an event that involved an exhibition where there was a representation of the Kaaba. The Kaaba in Mecca, you probably know what the Kaaba is, right? The Kaaba with a rainbow interpretation, right? So an LGBTQ revisiting of the Kaaba, which was taken and immediately serviced to the press and whatever. And those of you who are familiar with Turkey know to what extent homo and transphobia is strong in the country. So it was used as a pretext to increase the pressure. So many students were arrested, some were detained. It was really a mess. And this continued until more or less June, when suddenly Melih Bulu, the apparatchik who had been appointed in January, disappeared. He disappeared. He was, it's almost like a Soviet story. He completely disappeared. Nobody knows where he is. I mean, some people think he's in Macedonia or whatever, but he completely disappeared from the picture. And we waited, obviously, for his replacement because, and in order to this time have some kind of a preparation for the next move, the faculty decided to organize an informal and yet very extensive election, not in the form of the election of certain candidates, but in the form of the rejection, a vote of non-confidence of some faculty. So we got basically a list of 17, I think, candidates who were vetted by the faculty, and 3 of them, those who had joined the new governance, were vetoed in rates that reached 93, 95% of the electorate. And there were, if I'm not mistaken, close to 600 voters out of a faculty population that is more or less of 650 or 700. So a very representative, if you want, poll/election that at least gave the president the possibility of picking one of those 17 candidates who had been vetted from within and of showing to what extent we were against the 3 candidates who had joined forces with the now disappeared Melih Bulu. At the end of, I can't remember, 2-3 weeks, the presidential decree appointed Naci İnci, who was one of the collaborators, somebody from within, so somebody from our faculty, from the physics department, but somebody who, quote unquote, had sold his soul to the devil, had immediately started cooperating with the new governance, somebody whom I know personally and whom I found interesting way back when, because obviously of a conservative background, but I would never have imagined that he would have worked so clearly against the interest of the majority of the university. So basically, with ups and downs, the situation is continuing more or less at the same level. That is, there is still a passive resistance, but the faculty does not boycott the program. We are still teaching, or they are teaching. I'm thankfully here as a guest, but everybody continues to teach. But there's a continuous declaration of non-confidence and of a rejection against the present governance. Recently, violence has started again because a group of students have demonstrated in front of the new rector, Naci İnci, and they were immediately arrested. Again, you know, the same cycle of violence, of police violence exerted against the most vulnerable element in the equation. 3 faculty members, 2 part-time and 1 full-time, have been terminated. For the part-time, it's the easiest thing to do because all you have to do is not renew their contract. So they are technically also extremely vulnerable on grounds that were extremely specious and that had to do with them teaching things that were not of their specialty. But in fact, we know that all these 3 individuals were targeted for their political opinions and their very active presence in the reaction against the present governance at the university. So basically, that's more or less where we stand now. And I won't go into more details. We can talk about it at the end if you wish. A second point I would like to make, and I'm still talking about the tree, despite the title, is to give you some kind of a background information on Boğaziçi University, because there is a history to Boğaziçi University. As you may know, Boğaziçi University is a nationalized version of an American college that was created in 1863 by Protestant missionaries that became Robert College, a little bit like AUC in Cairo, AUB in Beirut, and which in 1971 was handed over by the board to the Turkish government with a series of conditions, but by and large, it kept its very Anglo-Saxon, in fact, American system. It is a university where all the teaching, except for the Turkish language and literature department, is done in English. So it is part of this very weird self-civilizing mission, self-orientalizing mission, which is in itself problematic. But it is this island, this oasis, if you want, of Western norms and forms in a country that is much more nationalistic and engaged in its nationalism than at Boğaziçi. What is also typical of Boğaziçi University is that it has evolved from a very small and elitist university to one that fully in the 1990s, especially from the 1990s on, fully fulfills its role of a public university. In the first years, as a heritage, as part of the heritage of Robert College, it was a very white university. Its faculty was very white. I'm using it with reference to the terminology used by certain sociologists and journalists in Turkey of white Turkishness, which is a cultural, sometimes ethnic, but especially cultural and political positioning that is at the border of Kemalism, progressive thought, and Westernization. The dose of each of these elements can change according to the individual. But by and large, in the 1970s and even in the 1980s, when I was a student there, it was a privileged university where coming from a high school, from a private high school where English was taught as the main language, was almost a guarantee of your getting in. And the rest was very much based on a celebration of some kind of an Ivy League on the Bosphorus. And many of my colleagues, especially of an older generation, belong to that profile, a very, and I'm not saying it meanly. Can you say bourgeois without being mean? I don't know. But a very bourgeois, very, white Turkish background. From the 1980s on, as the number of universities increased and as the student body diversified, thanks to the transition to a national exam, which is extremely problematic because it's a multiple choice exam, but still it's a national way, if you want, of selecting students on the basis of very, very concrete material, their answers to, I don't know how many hundred questions. The university's profile has started to change. And at least at student level, there is a very good representation of the country's socioeconomic and ethnic and religious. There's no religious diversity anyway. So, but at least socioeconomic and ethnic diversity, which has started in the 1990s to affect also the faculty. And we have more and more, the younger faculty is much closer to Turkish reality than the older faculty was in the 1970s or in the 1980s. This university has always been proud of its past, but its past has also been a liability in a country, as I said, which is in essence, extremely xenophobic and nationalistic. The fact that this was some kind of a byproduct of an American college, a Protestant college, the fact that classes were taught in English, the fact that it preserved the American system, the fact that it was located on a beautiful campus on the Bosphorus with a magnificent view was something that was always criticized by practically every political tendency on the spectrum. So it went from the degenerate heirs to the missionaries, to the bourgeois sipping their whiskey by the Bosphorus. I mean, there were all sorts of stigmata that came with Boğaziçi, and this was not just on the quote unquote conservative Islamist side. It was on all sides because, again, in Turkey, all sides are conservative. That is true of the People's Republican Party. It's true of practically every party. So this is, I think, part of the equation, and it is part of the reason why the university is getting mixed responses during its struggle against the present government. The university was also very prominent in setting the tone and the norms for academic freedom and for an electoral process in order to organize the governance of the university. In the 1980s, especially after 1980, the military coup, all the universities fell under the pressure of the junta with the imposition of all sorts of things, some of which have remained. I mean, our university still has two major institutions that have been inherited from the political intervention of the junta after 1980. One is the Institute for, oh my God, it's untranslatable, the Institute for Ataturk's Principles and the Kemalist Revolution or something. It sounds North Korean, right? Sounds North Korean, and that was one institution that was imposed on every university as part of the desire of the generals to indoctrinate the students. We've done what we do best, which is adapt compromise, if you want, but adapt something that was against our principles and turn it into what it is today called in English, because you cannot rename it in Turkish, it's the Institute for Modern Turkish History. So it's a typical effort to kind of co-opt something that we hated and turn it into something that is acceptable to our faculty. The second institution that we've inherited is a new school. So a school of education, which we didn't want and had no real need for, but which has been imposed on many universities and ours by the military government of the 1980s, and which has remained, because the problem is that once something is established, once there is some kind of an institutional creation, it's very difficult to go back. And therefore, what we've done again is try to modify the second-rate kind of level of this school at the beginning of its career and turn it into something that was compatible with the overall level of excellence that we like to think characterizes Boğaziçi University. After the 1980s were spent under the control of the military government and its offsprings. So until 1992, the university, and that's where we have a precedent to what's happened this year, the university was presided by somebody who was appointed from outside. I can't remember, he was an engineer, I think, from Istanbul Technical University, and he ruled the university until 1992 with all sorts of problems, but that were much less violent than the ones we are facing today. And in 1992, it is the faculty at Boğaziçi University that decided to put an end to the system by creating an ad hoc, a de facto electoral process, which was eventually accepted by Ankara as the norm, as the rule for all universities. And the process was simple. We would elect a list of candidates. They would be ranked according to the votes they got. And that list would be sent out to Ankara to the Institution for Higher Education, which has a very nice acronym in Turkish, which really gives you a sense of what it stands for. It's YÖK, YÖK, YÖK in Ankara. So YÖK would take that list, would select 3 of the top candidates, and would submit them to the president, who would then appoint the one with the highest votes. That was not necessarily what he had to do, though. That is, the system was again a compromise between an electoral process and an appointment process. There was nothing but just a gentleman's agreement or gentleperson's agreement between the university and Ankara to the effect that the institution for higher education and the president would select the top candidates from the list. They could have selected somebody from the bottom of the list. And that is what in 2016 was destroyed, this agreement between the two parties. And the result is, as we can see today, a complete situation of conflict and chaos. The third point I think I have to address is why. I mean, why is Erdogan, why is the AKP, why is the government doing this? There's one obvious response, which is that of, you might say, hatred and revenge. Again, something that you can link to the reputation of this university as being a very fertile ground for the propagation of subversive ideas, and inspired, of course, from the West. So there is as in all the nationalist parties in Turkey, there is some kind of a deep hatred of this university, which is increased by the fact that it has de facto become a very elitist university, not in terms of its practices, but in terms of its very selective recruitment of students due to the nature of the exam itself. The exam is a perfect offer and demand kind of exam. So because Boğaziçi is highly in demand, we end up getting the top 1, 2, 3% of the high school graduates of the country, which in a sense creates in a vicious circle, you might say, this elitist side to it. That is, it's extremely difficult to get into this university. And that, of course, creates frustration among large numbers of the population. This combined with the reputation, the anti-national reputation of the university has served it very badly when it comes to this animosity by a great majority of the population and by the government. Hatred and revenge, yes, but also one major problem which Erdogan himself admitted recently, the fact that they have not been able to create a cultural and intellectual hegemony. Now, why would you want to do that is another question, but it's a very interesting admission. And it is true in the sense that the AKP has been extremely poor in terms of trying to find some kind of an intellectual, some kind of a scientific, some kind of a scholarly ground for the propagation of its own ideology, its ideas, its values, its norms. And therefore, one typical attitude that comes from this frustration is the destruction of what is associated with the success of the others. Interestingly, it is from the AKP that an alternative form of reaction has emerged. And I want to talk about Şehir University, City University, which was created by Davutoğlu. You may remember him as way back when he was prime minister to Erdogan, one of the leading figures of the AKP, who was himself a graduate of Boğaziçi University, who knew exactly what the whiteness of Boğaziçi University meant to people like him from a background that you might call, conservative and whatever, but who nevertheless sent his own children to the same university, and who, I can't remember when exactly, decided to fund, together with some businessmen, a conservative Boğaziçi. That was what Şehir University was supposed to be. And the result was not perfect, but it was very interesting. It was a genuine effort at countering what they considered as the hegemony of the others by trying to create, through the same instruments and through the same kind of scholarly investment, to create an alternative. And guess what? That university was closed down by Erdogan the moment what's his name, Davutoğlu, passed on the into the opposition and became one of the foes of the AKP. So you can see how much this destruction how far this destruction can go, especially in the absence of a productive, constructive potential on their side. So now, let's look at the larger picture. Let's look at the general picture of what is happening in Turkey under the AKP, especially after 2013. I mean, 2013, Gezi might be some kind of a turning point. As a historian, I don't believe in turning points. I think that there are always elements of something to come in the future. But for reasons of practicality, I think we can take 2013 to be a rather significant turning point in the career of the AKP, and especially in the mental framework that dominates Erdogan and his entourage. Because the Gezi syndrome, this idea that they were out to get them, that there was some kind of a popular and of course Western-backed popular revolt in the making, and that this revolt wanted to destroy whatever achievements they had succeeded in making, has become one of the major concerns of the AKP government. Parallel to that, the AKP government has worked very efficiently on the polarization of the political scene and of the population. That is, on trying as much as possible by using nationalism, by using partisanship, and by using Islam to divide the country in order to consolidate their own electorate and to create a situation of tension that they thought and still think is favorable to their electoral projects. This is based mostly on Islamo-nationalism. That is, on the combination of nationalism, which is the hardcore essence of Turkish politics, regardless of political parties. I think the HDP is the only exception you can cite, and even in that case, there is, of course, a Kurdish nationalist trend in the HDP that cannot be forgotten. So nationalism is at the core of Turkish politics, and this is what makes the strength of the AKP. But the problem for the AKP is to try to turn this nationalism into something that is peculiar to them and cannot be confused with the nationalism of, say, the MHP, less so, but the CHP, the Republican People's Party. And therefore, Islam comes in as a very handy sauce, I might say, that defines and distinguishes the AKP from its rivals, giving them a very particular touch on the political spectrum. But apart from these ideological aspects, I think that the most important element of Turkish politics today is, at a macro level, what we've seen at Boğaziçi, which is a systematic desire to conquer the state. That is, for a political party or for a political entourage or for a political actor himself, to basically control everything that you would associate with the state in a normal situation, in a situation of the rule of law. This results in a total blurring of the boundaries between state and government. Government has become the state. It's not as clear as in, say, the single party period of the 1930s, where there was an equation between the two, but by promoting the staffing of the whole bureaucracy, by controlling every network of power that has something to do with the state, economically, financially, politically, administratively, the government, that is the AKP, the political party, is trying to basically conquer the state. And this obviously means that the Turkish state, contrary to the image that is generally given of it, is extremely weak. The Turkish state, and this, I will come to that at the end of my of my presentation, this is something that goes back to the end of the 19th century, from the moment the state was sacrificed to the political ambitions of certain strong men, certain strong groups, certain strong political parties, and that therefore the notion of the government becoming the state, the government controlling the state, has become almost systematically the norm for the country. Now, in order to problematize what I just said, and especially this communion between the AKP and other political parties around a certain political culture, a certain culture of violence and nationalism, I think I have to go back to my university to give you some examples that I find extremely disturbing and that go in the direction of what I'm claiming, the fact that the problem is not just the AKP, the problem is Turkish politics. The problem is Turkish nationalism. The problem is a certain form of power exerted by certain groups, by certain genders, by certain political actors in Turkey in ways that are extremely destructive of the survival of any kind of democracy or of autonomy. And for that, I have one example, one first example, which is back in 2005, when I was part of a group that organized a conference, a national conference on the fate of the Armenians at the end of the Ottoman Empire in 2005. This was a venture that was mostly controlled by historians from three universities, from Boğaziçi University, from Sabancı University, a private university, and from Bilgi University. I won't go into the details of the problems we encountered, but at the end of a long process and a lot of political opposition, the conference was held at Bilgi University in order to circumvent a law, a court order against against holding that conference at Boğaziçi. But what I remember most from that episode is that some of my colleagues who are now fighting for the autonomy and the academic freedom of Boğaziçi and for the survival of Boğaziçi were extremely violently opposed to this conference. And one of the arguments that they used was, you have to invite people of an opposed opinion, meaning genocide denialists. I mean, that was basically the argument. You have to do that. If you don't do that, it's not academic freedom, which is, you know, as ridiculous as inviting creationists to a biology conference. Right? I mean, you can do it if you find it interesting and funny and exciting and whatever, but it's not a prerequisite of academic freedom to constantly have to recognize all the denials that are behind certain ideas. So this only to tell you that some of the people who are fighting today for the academic freedom and autonomy of Boğaziçi have a vision of academic freedom that is not exactly the same as mine, and that I find to be incomplete. And if it is incomplete, I think it is due to the fact that they are, in a sense, victims of what I call this nationalist culture, this violent culture that predominates in Turkey. The second example is that of the involvement of LGBTQI plus groups in the resistance at Boğaziçi University. I remember that during one Zoom discussion, one colleague who was very engaged in protecting Boğaziçi University and its students remarked that it was so unfortunate that these students should have brandished the rainbow flag when they could have used the Turkish flag, and that would have been much more efficient. Now, obviously, I see the point from a purely pragmatic perspective. Obviously, if you try to oppose your opponent by using the same symbols as them, you are, in a sense, threatening their monopoly over those symbols. But a Turkish flag is a symbol of nationalism, whatever you do. And for a student to brandish the Turkish flag in resistance, in expressing his or her resistance to the police violence and to that illegitimate governance at Boğaziçi, that is too much. And I think the real idea behind that was basically that homophobia or distrust of all these issues is so widespread that it runs across the entire spectrum in ways that make it impossible for such groups to really obtain a recognition by a majority of people, even in a university like Boğaziçi. So this communion, if you want, over these two incidents, the fact that what I consider to be some basic rights, some basic principles that you should abide by when you talk about academic freedom or the autonomy of a university should not be necessarily accepted by all, gives you a sense of how difficult this is in the political environment of the time. So I'll finish with my conclusions as a historian. My conclusions as a historian are extremely dangerous because they tend to be deterministic. They tend to be essentialist. They tend to point at some kind of a Turkish Sonderweg, a unique path towards authoritarianism. But by and large, my belief is that things have changed irreversibly after 1876 and the coming to power of Abdülhamid and his building of an autocracy by essentially dismantling all the institutions, however imperfect they were, all the institutions of the rule of law that had been established by the Tanzimat bureaucrat. Again, no admiration for the Tanzimat statesman. I mean, it was a top-down kind of reform, but it was based on some kind of a bureaucratic notion of the rule of law, of the establishment of rules and regulations in order to establish some kind of a system that would have been predictable and accountable to not necessarily the public, but eventually, with the advent of Parliament in 1876, to some kind of a representation of the public. This is what Abdülhamid dismantled in 1878, after 1878, and he replaced with what is the most efficient and the most dangerous instrument of power, which is informal networking, spying, collusion, corruption, all the informal instruments of governance that you can associate with the rise of autocracy, combined with the first use of Islam in a way that already prefigures the constant flirting between Turkish nationalism and Islamic identity. And therefore, when he was replaced by the Young Turks, let's set aside the 3 or 4 years of springtime of Ottoman peoples. When the Unionists came to power with their triumvirate and with their military power, they pretty much replicated the same system of, again, informal governance, backed by the army and the police and by strong institutions in terms of the hardware, if you want, of the state. And when you look at Kemalism, it's pretty much the same. It is still the exercise of power in a rather arbitrary way against the rule of law, with a cosmetic recognition of some of the basic principles of parliamentary parliamentary rule, but basically a top-down control of society with a goal, which is that of the unification of the people, and modernity, with as a byproduct secularism. But that's pretty much the problem with Turkish secularism, because Turkish secularism is not what it should be. It is a cosmetic secularism that was created by the Kemalist regime in order to control Islam as a potential political rival, and not to grant real freedom to all cults or to atheism. It was, in fact, something that is very similar to what Erdogan is doing today, which is controlling the whole religious institution through this creation of the republic, which is the Diyanet İşleri Başkanlığı, the Directorate of Religious Affairs, which is some kind of a Şeyhülislamate, if you want, recreated in order to control a population which is assumed and accepted to be Turkish and Muslim and Hanifite and Sunnite and Hanifite. So by and large, if you follow the course of political change throughout the 20th century, you'll see that you have this constant clash between opponents who try to free themselves from the strong, the control of an authoritarian ruler or an authoritarian party, but who themselves have as a model the conquest of the state in order to promote their own power. This is pretty much what Menderes did in the 1950s. And this came to some kind of a lull with the revolution, with the coup of 1960, when Kemalism decided to work behind the curtains, behind the scene, by instituting the army and the judiciary as some kind of a watchdog of the system, giving the political parties enough liberty and freedom to play among themselves, as long as they did not cross some of the red lines that were imposed by the Kemalist doctrine. And this is what Erdogan, Özal before him started in a sense to mine and destroy this de facto rule of the judiciary and the military, but it was Erdogan's privilege to bring it to fruition, to bring it to its fulfillment, and this he did in order to reverse the whole thing and use his democratic powers, his popularity, to create a populist nationalist system that would eventually give him the possibility of controlling the state, of conquering the state for the interests of his own political party, of his own entourage. So, looking back at Boğaziçi, looking back at the microcosmos of Boğaziçi, I think it has to be contextualized, it has to be reframed in the larger picture of this very destructive political game that is being played in Turkey. And the problem, again, with my view as a historian of this continuity of authoritarianism and of the conquest of the state, is that I have little hope of seeing this disappear. That is, even if Erdogan loses in 2022 or 2023, whenever the elections, I'm not sure that the other political parties have really learned their lesson in terms of protecting the institutions of the state, making these institutions powerful enough to counter any ambition, any tendency, any trend of a government or of an individual to trespass and to destroy the boundaries of the state, and therefore to put an end to the rule of law and to every principle that you would associate with a sound, solid state. I'll stop at this, and if you have questions, we may go along tangents. There are other aspects of Turkish politics, the question of equality, the question of justice, and whatever that I always have found to be extremely important in trying to understand the dynamics of Turkish politics today. But I leave it at that and give you the floor if you have questions or comments. Some of you are from Boğaziçi, so I suppose you may have a different or a view of these events. So I'll just shut up. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this always impressive, your talks, this impressive talk. My immediate reaction is any hope?
Again, I'm a historian. I have no hope. I mean, hope is for the economists, and they always are wrong at the end. So prediction and whatever. There's always hope, obviously. I think that, okay, I've taken a very negative stand. I'm one of these people who have a tendency to see the half-empty glass rather than the half-full glass. But I think that's a good discipline if you want to achieve something. And therefore, I'm afraid that the political culture in Turkey is so deeply ingrained and so deeply reproduced at every level of society. I mean, political parties are authoritarian. I mean, every political party is led by one person who basically rules the political party without any leeway for opposition, whatever. And this, you could say, is true of practically every level in society. I mean, in the family, in gender, I mean, man over woman, parents over children, children over pets. You know, there is a hierarchy of violence, which I find so deeply ingrained. And so that's why I talked about this question of justice and equality. This is also one of my obsessions, right? I believe that Turkey runs on the notion of justice or equity. And justice or equity is something that is very Ottoman, very imperial, something that works perfectly in an unequal society. Because what it means is basically that you can treat justly people who are inferior to you. That's how it works. And for an empire, it's okay. I mean, for a traditional empire. But that's one of the reasons why Turkey has an enormous problem with equality, the notion of equality and of democracy. You can't have democracy if you don't have equality, and vice versa. And in Turkey, the notion of equality is an abstraction which has no real correspondence in human relations, in those that I've described, which are always hierarchical. And that is why the best a Turk will say about A, an Armenian, B, a Greek, C, a trans person is, I tolerate them, hoşgörü. And this is supposed to be a virtue, tolerating. When tolerating is considered a virtue, you have a serious problem. And this, I think, is one of the most crucial problems in Turkey. As long as this cannot be dealt with, I don't think we'll have any possibility of a true democracy. So my fear is basically the seesaw thing, this roller coaster between one party and then the other, taking revenge, and an ongoing vendetta where everyone, the moment they grab enough power to pressure the others, will use it. I mean, one example that I didn't and I forgot when talking, I'm sorry, my answers are always like that. One example about the culture at Boğaziçi that I find disturbing is that in the 1990s, at a time when the state was banning women with a scarf from attending classes at the university, Boğaziçi was the only university that turned the other way, that looked the other way, and that made it possible for these students to come. And yet, many of the faculty, some of whom are now protesting against the government, were in favor of bans against these women. You see, so that's really the problem. There is a very deeply ingrained culture of domination and crushing the other as long as you consider yourself to be powerful enough to do so.
Give us a lot of food for thought. Questions?
So finally, there's a Sonderweg, in a sense, which is very historical. I mean, for a historian like you. And then I would like to have a comment on, well, we usually think of Erdogan as a kind of, if not Islamist, of somebody with an Islamic project. They would say that this is Muslim brothers, whatever, and somehow I miss it from your speech. It seems as if he was another one of those who want to control. And of course, he's not alone in Europe in touching on universities. Okay, in Greece, for instance, we usually had a director elected by both students, professors, and the staff, the administrative staff. Our recent reform was to have just faculty elected. So he's not alone in a kind of a will to somehow control parts of. So to what extent do you think that Erdogan is a part of a more general European or whatever movement? I would like to have your comments.
Okay. Now, about the Sonderweg, yes, it's a Sonderweg, but then again, I do believe that there is an alternative path. I mean, if you want to caricaturize this, you have the Abdülhamid model and you have the Tanzimat model. And the Tanzimat model is also interwoven in the political history of this country. And therefore, there is always a possibility of seeing the rule of law. Again, I'm talking about institutions being strengthened to the point of at least establishing the grounds for a more legalistic and more democratic system, more accountable system. So I'm not saying, I see the authoritarian trend as a dominant one because it is backed by the people, but I see the other one as an option that may, with incentives such as Europe, such as the international community, be promoted and therefore counterbalance this propensity to authoritarianism. Now, about Erdogan's Islamism, that's a very problematic issue. And I do not find it productive to reduce him to an Islamist political figure, because I think that what really characterizes him is nationalism. Islamism is some kind of a coat of paint, a sauce, something that enables him to distinguish himself from Kemalism and from secular nationalism. So I agree, he's definitely not a secularist, but an Islamist is something different. And I think he's very conscious of the dangers of letting Islam loose, which is why he's using the Diyanet, very much like the Kemalists did, as a state institution that basically manages that area of the, and this is, I think, important from the perspective of the opposition in Turkey, because the opposition in Turkey loves to brand him as an Islamist, because then their own nationalism becomes less problematic. By pointing at him and criticizing him on the grounds of Islamism, they're first of all avoiding a conflict on a playground which he controls better than them: international relations, expansionism, xenophobia. I mean, this is something that all the political parties have in common. And the irony is that every time he makes a move that goes along the nationalist lines, the political parties of the opposition, again, HDP accepted, are unable to counter him because they're walking on common grounds and they fear the dangers of opposing the nationalist feelings of the great majority of the people. So in that sense, while I recognize that Islamism or Islam is a defining element of his political profile, I still believe that deep down, what really characterizes him, what really makes him enter this Sonderweg I've talked about, is the fact that, like Kemal, like Enver, like Abdul Hamid, he is part of this exercise of authoritarian rule with a nationalistic discourse, with a varying degree of Islamic sauce or Islamic taint to it. Finally, your question about other cases, yes. I mean, look at Orban and CEU. I mean, and of course, Orban had it even easier because CEU was really a non-national university, a private university. I mean, in the case of Boğaziçi, the irony is that it's a public university. It's a state university. So the government is attacking a state university. If you see the irony and the aberration in that, you'll understand what I mean by the government trying to conquer the state, because it doesn't make sense, really, because this is a state institution since 1971. So it's older than the AKP, it's older, and therefore you cannot even use the argument. But yes, I think that Orban, I think that the Polish situation, I'm not familiar with the Greek situation, and you're talking about an individual case, and it's not really the government. Yeah, but I think there was a similar problem in France when the government tried to control the universities. Obviously, there's always that, but in Turkey, what makes the difference is that you have like 220 universities and only a handful of those really could count as universities. It's a cemetery of electoral promises that were turned into universities when they didn't have the means, the staff and whatever. So it's a disastrous situation. And when you have just a handful of institutions that have the potential to be competitive and to bring some kind of a contribution to the population in terms of scholarship, in terms of science and education, and when you start to attack them in this way, it is something that cannot, I think, be compared to political grapplings as you have them in Greece or in France. But again, yes, there is a gradual move. I mean, everybody's saying it. The new authoritarianism, the new majoritarianism, the new populism, all of that is part and parcel of this. And yes, he fits perfectly in it. And in that sense, in many ways, he's not an exception. I agree.
Any other question? Comment? There is. You can do that after. Petro.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting. Two questions that are related mostly to the case of Boğaziçi. I mean, I wanted to ask if there were any communication or support from other universities. What was the case with those universities? And the other case was the mention of the police that you said. Because in the case of Greece, we have also now the government decided to found a sector of police in the universities in Greece, and I mean they're going to do it probably the next months, and there was a discussion about this similarity of Greece with Turkey. Because in this case, the police is going to be controlled by the police, not by the university or the authorities of the universities. And I want to know what is the exact status of the police as it is related to the universities in Turkey. I mean, because we saw that in the demonstrations, Boğaziçi, there was police, but could they enter? I mean, did the authorities of the university call them? How is this?
Okay. Please remind me of your first question. You said
this was a question of mine as well. Solidarity from other top universities.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And also, let me also say that this would be from the government as a special university corps, not directed from controlled by the police, but there would be
no. I mean, in Turkish universities, you have private security, which has been increased at Boğaziçi by the new administration in whatever ways they found useful, obviously. So the recruitment might have been made in collaboration, in cooperation with the government, I don't know. But for the police, it is the police. It is the police. It is the police which has always had the right to enter campus as long as the rector or the president required it. The thing is that to this day, it had never been required. So the novelty here is that the new governance is surrounding itself by armed policemen, by secret police, I mean, civilian cops who apparently are everywhere on campus, and an increased private security guard, which is apparently also very aggressive towards students. So there's no need, in a sense, for a new law, because the present situation allows for the president to invite as many policemen as he wants on campus. Now, the question of solidarity, there has been solidarity at student level, at faculty level, but not by the universities themselves. Because the universities themselves are also run by an administration which has been, in most cases, appointed in the same way by the same government. So therefore, it would be an aberration to expect them to come to the rescue of Boğaziçi. Private universities have been very quiet. So any show of solidarity has been only at the level of faculty and of students. And students, of course, that's the typical situation. Every time there is student trouble at the university, the comments from the government or from the police is that these are not really students. They're not really students. They are A, outsiders, B, terrorists, C, troublemakers and whatever. But the assumption is that in their vision, the only people who legitimately could maybe protest against something at the university have to be students. And why is that? I mean, there's no rule that says that. I mean, anybody could be, I mean, so it's always used, but as I said, I mean, solidarity has been expressed only at student and at faculty level.
So it's Eleftheria Zey.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I wanted to go back to the question of my colleague Socrates was asked. As I understood it from your speech, you make a distinction between Erdogan's attitude towards the university, towards Boğaziçi, and towards taking control of the university, and the taking control of the university that happens here in Greece or in France or in other countries of Europe. I mean, this is what happens here in Greece. It's in the name of a neoliberal way of taking over higher education, a model of a bureaucratic, capitalistic organization of higher education. While Erdogan's example is going back to an old-fashioned authoritarian model of taking over. You made the comparison with Abdul Hamid, which is a quite...
Or Mustafa Kemal, if you want.
Yes, exactly. Which is a quite... I used the expression old-fashioned, but I don't think it's the right expression. I mean, you said tolerance. Tolerance is a very traditional political tool of early modern absolutism in the global way, isn't it? So I think this is the distinction you made. And in this way, in this perspective, he's the only one. And it is quite different from what happens in Europe right now. We may have the same result, taking control of universities, the same result, but it's a quite different way of doing it, a quite different political way of doing it. Correct me.
I couldn't correct you even if you were wrong, and I don't think you are, because first of all, I don't know the Greek case enough to really compare it to the Turkish case. But from what I hear, I mean, a neoliberal takeover is something extremely problematic, but it is different from in Erdogan's case, or in the case of the AKP and Boğaziçi University. I'm not even sure they know exactly what they want. You see, the problem is that what they want immediately is to take over control. First, establish control. Then we don't know exactly what they want to do with it. I mean, there are several scenarios, and one of these, which I haven't mentioned, is that of, and that would be a very neoliberal thing, that of exploiting the properties of the university for fruitful enterprises. I mean, this is really prime space on the Bosphorus. And it is true that just a month ago, the university, a law, was it a law? A decree was passed changing the status of protection over that land, demoting it to a second degree of protection, which makes it possible to intervene on that land in ways that were unthinkable previously. And at the same time, our university's new governance issued a regulation defining the chain of command in the realization of rents, sales, and exploitation of the university's real estate. So obviously, plenty of people are already dreaming of Boğaziçi, the campus, being sold to the Qataris for some kind of a hotel or something. You know, that is also part of the rumor. But I think that the real problem is that they have no clear plan other than conquering. That's the problem of conquest, because I mean, you conquer and then you think. First you grab that asset and then you think about what you're going to do with it. Because I'm pretty sure there are conflicting opinions in the AKP about what should be done with Boğaziçi if it were completely conquered. I mean, and it would probably range from, let's turn this into a resort, to let's turn it into a religious school, a school of theology or whatever. It could be anything. So I don't think it's clear in their minds presently. And I think that's part of the problem, because predictability is important. I mean, when you know what they want to do, at least you can try and understand, but you don't even have that. It's clear that they have absolutely no respect, but that's not unique to them, for the humanities and for the social sciences, that they're interested only in engineering, in the hard sciences, in law, but other than that, I don't think they have a clear plan. And even the fact, I mean, I think it's rather striking. You put an apparatchik at the head of this university, of this institution, and 6 months later, you have to remove him because he was inefficient. I mean, it really means that you hadn't planned it well. So I think there's that problem too, but.
Yes, and then Socrates, which is now, I'm just making the range, and this is a very last question because it's getting late.
Returning to questions of Petros about the police, I want to make some additions and actually a correction about the police entering to university. Actually, in Boğaziçi, after 1992, where was a rectorate occupation, and police never invited to campus until 2009 or 10, I guess 2009, when Erdogan came to university for an opening of Technopark, which was actually like, when I looked at the Boğaziçi retrospectively there, actually we see that change in the governance methods that can be reflected there. So about other universities, police presence and security presence there, actually, it was always there, before AKP and after that. But in Boğaziçi, we see the phases. So before 2010, when I look back to that times, I was feeling like actually we were in a bubble, kind of bubble. And the first time police center, what was that year when Erdogan came? And it was a smooth intervention by police. Like, it wasn't that much violent at that time. But also in 2018, during the rectorate of Mehmet Özkan, which was also a point. I think when we look to the Melih Bulu example and these last incidents, when we just focus on that, that makes it not complete. And also it affects our analysis, because between 2016 and 2020, there was another appointee which for the first time let the police enter the university and violently caused to the the students taking custody. And there is also a middle period, like before 2015, like when the peace process ends, let's say, and with the coup d'etat, the time of the coup d'etat after 2015, we have the event about the peace academics, the extermination of the contract of the Naomi Levi-Aksu, which was from our department, history department, and Abbas Wali, again, a vulnerable part of the faculties, which were foreign professor, so their contract didn't renew. So with all this, between 2010 and 2015, we again will be able to reflect to macro politics, but in a certain level. With the existence of a appointee rectorate, made it in between. But in general, the faculty members and the professors in general came to a compromisation at that time. So it was like students were a bit marginalized, and the support to the other academics, like Naomi Levi-Aksu and Abbas Wali, fade away very quickly when I look back that time, and also the demonstration of students. Like it faded away very quickly because of the lack of solidarity, actually, or like lack of like solidarity in general inside the university. It's different than today's. But today, like after coup d'etat, the government attempt like to intervene to the university were always like whenever you get close to macro politics, there was an intervention. But when you are, you know, out of macro politics, didn't reflect to macro politics, it was smooth, like, as in case of in most events, it was finding their way. But today, what happening is like direct crash. There is no stopping it. Like, and okay, now like it went over in everywhere of Turkey because it is a point phenomenon of the in the municipalities. It took over all the Kurdish cities, for example, and like all these clashes during the 2015 and 16. Like, this is a very dark period. Like when I look back, I see like a very big darkness at that time. I don't know. I wanted to also add this because
No, I agree.
too much like ups and downs inside, and this middle period is like so dark in one sense, but now like it's just crashing, like crashing every kind of opposition. So like somehow like, big part of Turkey, like who is opposing to what's going on, had to be like a show of solidarity, came together.
Okay, I agree. First of all, I stand corrected on what you reminded me. That is, there were at least two cases of police intervention on campus. That's true. On the basis of that practice, which is that of invitation by the president. It is true also, and this is, I think, what I called it. Mehmet Özkan was a compromise. It was taken as a compromise by the faculty. He was kind of voted at a General Assembly. He did something that the others couldn't do, that Melih couldn't do, which is present himself to the General Assembly and get some kind of a vote of confidence. And that made us feel better. Right? So it is a compromise. I agree. And in that sense, and I think I said that too, it should have been a wake-up call. Right? And it was not. We didn't do anything for the 4 years that followed, thinking that, hey, this is as bad as it gets. as good as it gets, but also as bad as it gets. And now you're absolutely right. This is a full force attack on the university with no longer any limits, any parlaying, any compromise, any negotiation. So yes, it is totally different in that sense. So I agree, and you're right to point out this escalation, but this is what I call the compromise with the devil, in a sense, where you, and it is also true that ever since 2016, especially, the students, or at least part of the student body, has always been much more radically involved than faculty. Faculty has always tried to find a way to navigate the difficulties of the time. Students, or at least some students, have never wanted to make such a compromise. And this was clear in 2016 when Mehmet Özkan was opposed. The faculty was accused of collaboration, in a sense, with somebody who was appointed, which technically is true. It's a political choice. And as I said, it may have been the wrong choice. That is, the resistance should have probably started then on the basis of principles. Because if the question is one of principles, those principles were abandoned then, not in 2021. So I agree. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, as they would say. No, I mean, no, but seriously, I mean, that's true. But that's the problem of history. You can't redo it. And it's always easier to look with hindsight at things that could have been done differently. But I don't know. Let's hope for the best. We never know.
Is there a last question?
Maybe a long answer or a short one.
Have you heard a short answer from me?
Yeah, for me. Well, you said that Erdogan is present himself as not a continuation of Ottoman history, or he makes a choice of. Does he has a specific Ottoman period that he likes very much? Does he make any kind of specific?
Yes.
You almost made something for the Tanzimat period.
No, he loves Abdul Hamid. He's a Hamid fan. But why? I mean, yeah, but I mean, it's understandable. It's understandable because, first of all, I don't think, I mean, he's evolved in time in his own way, right? I mean, at the beginning, it was more about Suleiman the Magnificent, you know, the easy parts. But Hamid has this attraction of being more or less contemporary of Mustafa Kemal, being kind of a damned figure of history, which you want to save from a history that was written by the West, by the Kemalists, by this, by that. So you want to save him from this very unjust treatment. He is, of course, and Erdogan is of a generation who grew up with books such as Ulu Hakan Abdülhamid Han by a certain Necip Fazıl Kısakürek, who is a terrible historian, but a great demagogue, who came up with this image of the last great sultan. He went so far as to say, well, he went so far. He said, hey, we are proud of Mehmet the Conqueror, but they had it easy because they came at the time their empire was powerful. What's extraordinary about Abdülhamid is that he resisted against all the nations of the world for 33 years, and he maintained the empire. So you can see what kind of, and of course, Abdülhamid is Islam. He's pan-Islamism, Islamism. So he has everything to please the generation of Erdogan, the generation of the Milli Görüş, of the national vision, which is, you know, an Islamist, nationalist vision where he's the perfect anti-Kemal. That's the advantage. And that's the problem with Turkish politics today, because the Kemalists, and there are still Kemalists, insist on the fact that what really makes Erdogan bad is Islam, not his nationalism. You know, it's all this complexity of a political spectrum that is completely obsessed with ideology, with the past, with an idealized past, with their heroes, with their. It's terrible. That's again my reaction as a historian, to see history being constantly used, abused, misused for political purposes in ways that are unacceptable. So, Hamid.
So thank you very, very much for this extremely interesting presentation. Are you business? Well, we don't know about the answer. So yes, and last one. Yes, please.
Actually, I want to add a very small comment and also to bring the Greek case and Turkish case in that sense, because Neo-Democratia came to power in the very first year of mine here. So, and what happens here, like my observations, I don't know in detail, but it reminds me in many phases the first years of AKP, especially also in the academic realm, because what AKP did in the first years was integrating neoliberal politics with the universities. And also like nationalistic or like police state methods to universities now. And with the new regulation about the police, university police, and also another regulation of security. I heard that like kind of a police force, but specifically for universities. No, no. In Turkey, it's mostly private securities. So they are using both in every realm. And also another regulation about the demonstration rules. I don't know if it is rejected or accepted. And like, since Neo-Democratia came to power, for example, this year, 200 years of Greek Revolution, and like every day hearing about Erdogan, recreating images of enemies. So like what's happening here in the last 3 years is like most of the things in the social realm also, like ban of the cigarette, and like become more civilized again in many manners. So, I think that maybe in other times we can discuss about those topics also. But since Neo-Democratia came to the power, like I am sometimes saying to some friends, I hope I will be wrong about this, but welcome to Turkey. Welcome to Middle East.
Okay, well, thank you. I won't answer that. I will just say that if it's the beginning, like the AKP, well, at least you have another 5, 6, 10 years of relative peace until the shit hits the fan, as they say.
Okay, thank you very much, and we do hope we'll see you soon again in December. So, but for now, thank you very, very much for this.